My mother-in-law demanded I quit my job to serve her. She didn't expect me to become her boss instead. My mother-in-law handed me a resignation letter she had written in my name. 3 years later, she sat across a conference table waiting for me to decide whether she still had a job. The letter appeared beside my plate during Sunday dinner, folded once and printed on the cream stationery Vivian Hale used for charity invitations and condolences. At first, I assumed it concerned one of her committees. Then I saw my manager's name at the top. The letter thanked him for 7 rewarding years at Calder Health Systems and explained that I was resigning immediately to focus on my family responsibilities. It promised a smooth transition, expressed regret for the short notice, and ended with a signature line beneath my full name. Vivian had even spelled my middle name correctly. She watched me read it with the calm satisfaction of someone presenting a plan already approved. My husband, Marcus, kept cutting his roast. Vivian was scheduled for hip replacement surgery in 6 weeks. Her surgeon expected her to walk the same day, leave the hospital within 48 hours, and need part-time assistance during the early stage of recovery. She had excellent insurance, a housekeeper, a driver, and enough money to hire private nursing care around the clock. None of that mattered to her. She had decided I would quit my job and move into her home for at least 6 months. The word serve was the one she used. Not help, not visit, not coordinate, serve. She explained that a paid caregiver could handle bathing and medication, but only family could protect her dignity, manage the household, receive guests, prepare the food she tolerated, organize her correspondence, and make sure the staff did not become lazy while she recovered. She said my work had always been unusually demanding for a married woman anyway. I was 34 years old and director of clinical operations at Calder Health Systems. I supervised a team that helped hospitals reduce medication errors, improve discharge planning, and keep understaffed units from collapsing during surges. I had earned a master's degree at night while working full-time. 2 weeks before that dinner, I had been selected to lead the largest implementation contract in our division's history. Vivian described all of that as computer work. She ran Hale House Living, a company her late husband had founded with 1 assisted living residence 28 years earlier. By the time I married Marcus, it had become a regional chain of 9 elegant properties, known for marble lobbies, formal dining rooms, and glossy advertisements showing silver-haired couples holding champagne. Vivian treated the company as proof that she understood both business and care better than anyone else. In her version of the family, men inherited responsibility, and women made that responsibility possible. Marcus was the future of Hale House. My role was to remove inconvenience from his path. I asked whether he had seen the resignation letter before dinner. He finally put down his knife. His answer was careful, which told me everything. They had discussed it for weeks. Marcus said his mother needed us. He said my salary was no longer essential because he expected to become chief executive of Hale House within the year. He called the arrangement temporary and reminded me that Vivian had helped with the down payment on our house. She had not. She had offered us money, attached conditions to it, and become offended when I used my own savings instead. The house was purchased with equal contributions from Marcus and me. The deed, mortgage, and bank statements all proved it. But facts were never as useful to Vivian as obligations she could invent. I placed the unsigned letter back on the table. I said I would help coordinate appropriate care after surgery. I would visit, bring meals, attend medical appointments when possible, and make sure Marcus understood the recovery plan. I would not resign. Vivian's expression changed only slightly. The warmth disappeared first. She said the decision had already been made. I told her decisions about my employment required my participation. That was almost the entire conversation. Vivian did not shout. She did not need to. She spent the rest of dinner speaking to Marcus as if I had left the room. By dessert, she had revised the story. I was no longer a woman protecting a career. I was a selfish wife abandoning an injured widow. Marcus said nothing to correct her. On the drive home, he told me I had embarrassed him. I asked why refusing to sign a false resignation was more embarrassing than his mother writing one. He said I was focusing on the wrong thing. That sentence became the shape of our marriage over the next 2 months. Whenever I mentioned my job, the wrong thing was my ambition. Whenever I mentioned boundaries, the wrong thing was my tone. Whenever I asked why he had planned my future without me, the wrong thing was that his mother was frightened about surgery. I might have believed the fear if Vivian had wanted care. What she wanted was obedience with witnesses. 3 days after dinner, she sent the family a recovery schedule. It assigned me mornings, evenings, and every overnight from Sunday through Thursday. It included meal requirements, visitor lists, laundry instructions, charity correspondence, and a reminder that fresh flowers were to be changed before they wilted. The schedule began 1 week before her surgery and ended 6 months later. My name appeared beside 187 separate duties. Marcus had 12. His duties included joining her for dinner twice a week and reviewing company mail. When I refused the schedule, Vivian began calling my office. She told my assistant there had been a family emergency. She asked for my travel calendar. She left messages during client meetings and once called a hospital administrator directly after finding his name on a public conference program. I documented every contact. My manager, Samuel Ortiz, did not treat the situation as gossip. He asked whether I felt safe, reminded reception not to disclose my schedule, and moved my personal information out of the public staff directory. He also told me something that made my stomach turn. A woman identifying herself as my mother had called Human Resources the previous week to ask how quickly health insurance ended after a voluntary resignation. My mother had been dead for 9 years. The call came from Hale House headquarters. I confronted Marcus that evening. He admitted Vivian had asked one of her assistants to gather information. He said she was trying to make the transition easier. There was no transition. There was only a campaign to create one. I changed the passwords on my email, banking, retirement account, and employee portal. I moved my passport, academic records, tax returns, and jewelry into a safe deposit box. Then I downloaded 5 years of joint financial statements. I did not do it because I planned to leave. I did it because, for the first time, I understood that my husband and his mother considered access to my life the same thing as permission. The statements showed me how far that belief had spread. For 8 months, Marcus had been transferring money from our joint savings into a Hale House investment account. The withdrawals were small enough to look ordinary at first, $2,000, then $5,000, then $3,000. Altogether, he had moved $46,000. Half of that money was mine. He said it was a short-term bridge and that the family company would repay us after refinancing. I asked why a successful assisted living chain needed secret loans from our household. He said every business had timing issues. Then he blamed me for checking. I slept in the guest room that night. The next morning, I opened an account in my name, redirected my salary, and met with a family law attorney during lunch. I still hoped Marcus might recognize what he had done. I gave him one opportunity to disclose the transfers, replace my share, and attend counseling. Instead, he told Vivian. By that evening, she had informed the extended family that I was threatening divorce while she prepared for major surgery. 2 cousins sent messages about loyalty. An aunt reminded me that marriage required sacrifice. Someone I had met twice wrote that careers could be rebuilt, but family could not. None of them mentioned the forged resignation letter or the missing money. Vivian's surgery went well. She walked before dinner and returned home 2 days later with a physical therapist, a home health nurse, and the private caregiver Marcus finally hired after I refused to move in. I visited once. Her home looked less like a recovery space than a hotel suite before an important guest arrived. Flowers filled the hallway. Silver trays waited in the kitchen. Her assistant carried a clipboard containing the same schedule that had once carried my name. Vivian was seated in a motorized recliner wearing silk and disapproval. She told me the paid caregiver lacked initiative. I looked around at 6 employees working inside the house and understood that the problem had never been a shortage of help. The problem was that none of them proved she controlled me. I stayed 20 minutes. Marcus did not come home that night. Over the next 3 weeks, he moved most of his clothes into his mother's guest wing. He told friends he was caring for her. In reality, the private staff handled her recovery while he worked in the study, preparing for the executive role she had promised him. He filed for divorce before I did. The petition described our marriage as broken by my refusal to support his family obligations. My attorney answered with bank records. The divorce lasted 11 months. Marcus tried to classify the $46,000 as a joint investment. Hale House could not produce a subscription agreement, repayment schedule, ownership certificate, or board approval. The money had gone into an operating account and disappeared into payroll. The court credited my half against the property settlement. I kept the house by refinancing it in my name. Marcus kept whatever future Vivian had promised him. We divided everything else according to documents rather than family mythology. I did not ask Calder Health to reduce my workload. I led the hospital implementation Vivian believed I should abandon. The project finished 6 weeks early and reduced readmissions by 14% during its first year. That result attracted Meridian Care Partners, a national company that acquired and repaired struggling healthcare operations. Meridian offered me a role overseeing quality and integration for senior living properties. The work was difficult and unglamorous. I visited facilities where beautiful brochures hid broken call systems, exhausted nurses, empty activity calendars, and kitchens stretching food budgets beyond reason. I learned to read staffing schedules against payroll, occupancy reports against resident records, and polished executive assurances against what night shift employees whispered when managers left. I also learned that most failing care businesses were not destroyed by one dramatic scandal. They failed through hundreds of choices that made appearances more important than people. That lesson kept reminding me of Vivian. My first assignment at Meridian was a residence called Westmere Court, 4 hours from home. Its lobby smelled of lemon polish and fresh lilies. Its website promised gracious independence. The financial packet said the property needed a minor operational reset. The night nurse told a different story. She had worked 11 consecutive shifts because 2 colleagues quit and a third was injured. The building had reduced agency staffing to protect its monthly margin. Managers filled vacancies on the official schedule with names followed by the word orientation, although some of those people had not completed background checks and never entered the building. I arrived at 6 in the evening and stayed until breakfast. I watched one nursing assistant answer 12 call lights while helping a resident with dementia search for a husband who had died 20 years earlier. I watched the same assistant skip her break, warm 3 meals, clean a spill, and apologize to families for delays created by decisions made far above her salary. At 2 in the morning, a resident named Mrs. Bell pressed her call button because she was afraid to walk to the bathroom alone. The light remained unanswered for 16 minutes. Nothing terrible happened, but only because the night nurse noticed it while carrying medication to another floor. The next morning, the executive director described the delay as an isolated incident. I placed the call system report beside the staffing records. There had been 47 waits longer than 15 minutes that week. That was when I understood the difference between a problem and a pattern. A problem could be blamed on a busy night. A pattern had authors, budgets, warnings, and people who benefited from not naming it. We suspended new admissions for 9 days, brought in qualified temporary staff, and called every affected family. Meridian lost money that quarter. The property survived because we stopped pretending the numbers mattered more than the residents creating them. Samuel had taught me to document interference at Calder. Westmere taught me what documentation could save when leaders were willing to read it. I became the person Meridian sent when attractive reports did not match ordinary human experience. At a coastal residence, I found food invoices shrinking while occupancy supposedly rose. The chef had been told to substitute powdered drinks for prescribed supplements without clinical approval. At another, maintenance marked broken window locks complete because a regional vice president wanted the capital report to remain green before a refinancing meeting. None of the discoveries felt glamorous. Most began with a tired employee saying something did not make sense. I learned to ask housekeepers which rooms stayed empty, cooks how many plates they served, receptionists which families complained twice, and drivers how often residents missed appointments. Executives prepared presentations. Frontline employees carried the truth in routes, trays, keys, and unfinished tasks. Meridian gave me authority slowly. First, I supervised 1 integration, then 3. After 18 months, I led a team of nurses, accountants, human resources specialists, property engineers, and compliance attorneys. I never pretended to know their disciplines better than they did. My value was recognizing when separate details formed one system. A payroll anomaly could explain a staffing shortage. A maintenance delay could explain a fall. A marketing promise could explain why managers hid both. The work rebuilt a part of me the divorce had damaged. Marcus and Vivian had treated my career as an ornament I should remove when it inconvenienced them. Meridian treated my judgment as something with measurable value. Nobody there asked whether ambition made me a bad wife. They asked whether my recommendations could survive evidence, regulation, and the consequences of being wrong. That standard was demanding. It was also fair. My private life became quieter. I sold the dining table where Vivian had once lectured me about family roles and replaced it with a smaller one I actually liked. I painted the guest room deep blue after Marcus complained for years that dark colors lowered resale value. I traveled when projects required it and came home without explaining my schedule to anyone. The first Christmas after the divorce, I received a formal invitation to Vivian's house. My name was printed without the title Mrs. At the bottom, someone had written that family should put conflict aside during sacred seasons. There was no acknowledgement of the money, the false resignation, or the months of pressure. The invitation offered access without accountability. I declined. Several relatives called. I stopped answering after the first 2 repeated Vivian's claim that Marcus had only moved our savings because he was trying to protect the family legacy. The legacy had not protected our marriage, our money, or the employees whose salaries depended on it. I no longer argued with people committed to misunderstanding those facts. Marcus's career rose quickly after the divorce. Vivian announced his appointment as Chief Development Officer in a trade publication. The photograph showed them standing in the lobby of a planned residence called Bellwether Ridge. Marcus wore the same expression he used when accepting praise for group projects, grateful enough to appear humble, certain enough to believe the outcome had always belonged to him. The article said he had spent years preparing to lead Hale House into its next generation. Those years apparently included transferring our savings without consent and studying expansion plans in his mother's guest wing while private nurses handled her recovery. I clipped nothing. I followed the company only through public filings and inspection notices necessary for my work. Bellwether Ridge opened 9 months late. A second development opened before it reached stable occupancy. A third broke ground while interest rates were climbing and construction costs were exceeding estimates. From the outside, the strategy looked bold. From inside healthcare operations, it looked hungry. New buildings create photographs, press releases, and borrowing opportunities. Existing residents create repetitive obligations. Enough trained people every night, enough food every day, enough maintenance before a small defect becomes an injury. Vivian loved what could be unveiled. She had less patience for what had to be sustained. One evening, after a Meridian conference, Lena Brooks approached me near the hotel elevators. I recognized her name from inspection reports, but had never met her. She directed Cedar Grove, one of Hale House's oldest properties, and had worked there for 13 years. She asked whether our conversation could remain private. I told her I could listen, but I could not promise secrecy if she described immediate danger to residents. She understood. Lena said Hale House had ordered every property to reduce labor by 8% while maintaining the same resident care plans. Directors were told to use salaried managers to fill floor shifts, delay non-urgent repairs, and combine overnight assignments. At the same time, headquarters added a founder relations department and hired a design consultant owned by Vivian's niece. Lena had objected. Her regional supervisor told her to become more solutions-oriented. She brought no stolen files and asked me for no job. She wanted to know whether the industry had truly become this cruel everywhere, or whether she had stayed too long in one company. I told her understaffing was common, financial pressure was real, and none of that made dishonest schedules acceptable. Then, I advised her to use Hale House's compliance channel, document resident safety concerns through the approved system, and keep personal notes that contained no protected health information. I did not recruit her, I did not mention my marriage, but before Lena left, she said employees knew Vivian had once tried to make her daughter-in-law quit a healthcare career to become a personal attendant. The story had become a joke at headquarters. According to the version Vivian repeated, I was an ungrateful analyst who imagined myself too important to help an elderly woman recover. I asked whether Lena knew that Vivian had 6 paid employees in her house during those weeks. She did not. I asked whether she knew Vivian had written the resignation letter herself. She stared at me for a moment, then shook her head. I realized Vivian had not merely explained our conflict, she had converted it into management folklore. My refusal became proof that educated women lacked loyalty. Employees heard the story when asking for flexible schedules, promotions, or time away to care for their own families. Vivian had turned my life into a warning. I returned to my room, angry in a way I had not been during the divorce. Not because strangers believed a lie about me, because the lie was being used against women who still depended on Vivian for wages and references. The next morning, I wrote a detailed account for my attorney and saved the date of my conversation with Lena. I did nothing else. I had no standing inside Hale House, and using Meridian to confront a competitor over family gossip would have been reckless. Restraint did not feel satisfying. It was still the right choice. 6 weeks later, Lena used the compliance channel. Her report identified overnight staffing gaps, altered schedules, delayed incident reviews, and pressure to admit residents whose needs exceeded the property's licensed capabilities. The hotline vendor transmitted the complaint to Hale House's compliance committee. The committee included Vivian, Marcus, and the general counsel. Instead of investigating the allegations, they investigated Lena. Her email access was reviewed. Her expense reports were questioned. A consultant interviewed employees about her attitude. Headquarters concluded that she had created a negative culture and placed her on a final performance plan. She was fired before the quarter ended. I learned the details much later during acquisition diligence. At the time, I only saw her departure announced as an opportunity for new leadership at Cedar Grove. Lena found work with a nonprofit residence for less money. She kept her notes. Hale House kept the pattern. The expansion debt grew harder to hide. Bellwether Ridge offered discounts that were not reflected in investor occupancy reports. Sales teams collected refundable deposits months before apartments were ready. Headquarters counted those reservations as if residents had moved in and paid full monthly fees. The accounting difference looked technical. It was not. Lenders allowed Hale House to borrow based partly on occupancy and cash flow. Inflating either allowed the company to draw money it might not otherwise receive. That money then covered construction overruns and ordinary payroll, creating the need for more optimistic reporting the following month. The company was not stealing one dramatic sum, it was borrowing against a version of the future that employees had already warned would not arrive. Vivian protected the appearance of confidence. She hosted a 30th anniversary gala beneath a ceiling covered in white flowers. Trade reporters praised Hale House for expanding during a difficult market. Marcus presented a video of future properties, including 2 sites the company had not purchased. Meanwhile, an elevator at Cedar Grove remained unreliable for 17 days. Residents on the 3rd floor missed activities and meals in the formal dining room. Staff carried trays upstairs. One resident attempted the stairs and fell. The internal incident report listed personal non-compliance as a contributing factor. The delayed repair did not appear in the summary sent to the board. This was how Vivian's values moved through a company. She did not need to order anyone to lie about a fall. She only needed managers to understand which truths damaged careers. Meridian promoted me to Vice President of Quality Integration near the end of my 2nd year. The role required board presentations. The first time I entered our headquarters conference room, I remembered the way Vivian spoke across her dining table as if my future were a housekeeping issue. My hands shook while I connected my laptop. Then the first slide appeared, and the fear became work. I presented a rescue plan for 6 rural residences Meridian had acquired from a bankrupt operator. The plan protected every resident placement, retained 86% of employees, and reduced agency spending by increasing permanent wages rather than cutting shifts. One director challenged the cost. I showed him the projected turnover, training, overtime, and regulatory expenses of the cheaper option. He changed his vote. After the meeting, Meridian's chief executive, Evelyn Shaw, told me I did not fill a room by speaking louder. I filled it by making evasion difficult. It was the best professional compliment I had ever received. Evelyn became a mentor, though she never used the word. She included me in lender calls, made me defend assumptions, and returned weak briefing papers covered in questions. She also watched how I handled conflicts. When a vendor offered me tickets after winning a contract, I reported it. When a former Calder colleague applied to my team, I disclosed the relationship and left the final interview to another leader. When an executive asked me to soften a safety finding until after a sale, I refused in writing. Evelyn later said expertise could be hired more easily than independence. That principle would determine why Meridian trusted me when Hale House appeared. Before it did, Vivian made one final attempt to pull me back into her hierarchy. She sent a message claiming Marcus was ill and needed family support. I contacted him directly. He was not ill. He had experienced a panic attack after a lender rejected financing for the third development. He was receiving appropriate care and did not want me involved. Vivian had used his private medical event to reopen contact. When I told her never to misrepresent an emergency again, she replied that divorce did not erase duty. I saved the message. Months later, it became relevant for a reason neither of us expected. Hale House submitted an insurance claim seeking reimbursement for executive home care services after Vivian's surgery. The claim appeared in a folder reviewed during diligence. It listed extensive nursing and household support as company expenses required for executive continuity. The amounts were real. The description was not. Several invoices had been issued by Hale Family Support Services, a vendor formed 2 weeks before her surgery and owned by Vivian's cousin. The nurses actually came from a licensed agency that billed a fraction of the amount. Hale Family Support added coordination fees, household management charges, and executive security services. Company money paid for flowers, a private chef, Marcus's stay in the guest wing, and the assistant who prepared the schedule assigning me 187 duties. Vivian had demanded that I provide free labor, while Hale House reimbursed her family for pretending to coordinate paid care. The arrangement was not the largest problem in the acquisition. It was the clearest. It showed how Vivian combined family obligation with corporate money. Relatives were paid. Employees were pressured. I was expected to donate the work that made the arrangement look respectable. The vendor contract carried Marcus's approval. The supporting statement said no immediate family member was available to assist because of unavoidable professional obligations. That sentence was dated 3 days after Vivian placed the resignation letter beside my plate. By the time I saw it, the divorce was final and the anger had cooled into something sharper. The document proved that Vivian never believed my presence was medically necessary. She had already built a reimbursable care structure. She wanted my resignation because controlling me mattered more than needing me. I disclosed the personal connection to Meridian's counsel immediately. The document was sealed within the diligence record, and another executive supervised that part of the review. My attorney confirmed that the old insurance and vendor issues did not change the divorce settlement. I made no attempt to reopen it. Truth did not always need to produce a second payment to matter. Sometimes it simply ended the last doubt. The independent diligence team found 5 related party vendors tied to Vivian's relatives. One provided interior design services at rates far above market. One arranged entertainment. One supplied imported linens despite repeated complaints that basic medical equipment was delayed. Not every contract was illegal. All had been approved through a process Vivian controlled. The board minutes described them as competitive selections, but there were no competing bids in 3 files. In another, the alternative bid had been submitted by a company using the same mailing address as Vivian's vendor. Marcus signed the certifications sent to lenders. His defense was that finance prepared the documents. Finance produced emails showing he had asked employees to adjust the timing of invoices and deposits so the ratios would clear. One message said the numbers only needed to be true on reporting day. That sentence became central to the lender negotiations. Meridian did not approach the acquisition as a punishment. Hale House still had value that could be preserved. Its oldest properties sat on land purchased decades earlier. Many directors were competent people constrained by headquarters. Families wanted continuity. A chaotic receivership would hurt residents first and executives last. The rescue therefore had to separate the company from the people using it as a monument. Evelyn asked me what conditions I considered non-negotiable. I said, resident deposits must be isolated immediately. Safety reporting must bypass the family. Staffing numbers must be verified through payroll and building access, not scheduled names. Related party contracts must be suspended pending review. No executive could retain authority merely because removal felt embarrassing. Then I said I should not lead negotiations with Vivian or Marcus. Evelyn agreed. An independent transaction committee handled price, employment terms, and releases. Outside counsel documented every contact. I received information only when it became necessary for the operating plan. Vivian still assumed I had designed the entire transaction to reach her. That belief revealed how she understood power. She could not imagine receiving consequences from a system unless one offended person had ordered them. In reality, dozens of people reached the same conclusion through separate evidence. Nurses, accountants, inspectors, lenders, attorneys, property directors, and board members. I was not the author of Hale House's crisis. I was simply qualified to help repair it. During the final week before signing, Vivian asked for a private meeting with me. Counsel declined. She appeared instead in the lobby of Meridian's headquarters without an appointment. Security called my office. I met her in a glass conference room with Evelyn and an attorney present. Vivian looked smaller than I remembered, but not uncertain. She placed a leather folder on the table and said Hale House belonged to her family. Inside were photographs of groundbreakings, anniversary dinners, magazine covers, and her late husband standing beside the first residence. There were no staffing reports, no resident deposit statements, no photograph of the employee who answered 12 call lights alone. Vivian said I knew what the company meant to Marcus. I said the transaction committee had already explained the alternatives. She asked how I could take from him the future I once promised to support. That was the closest she came to acknowledging our marriage. I reminded her that Marcus's future was being reviewed by people who had never attended our wedding and had no interest in our divorce. His certifications, development decisions, and use of company funds were in the record. The result would come from those facts. Vivian turned to Evelyn and said I had always been cold. Evelyn asked whether Vivian wished to discuss a transaction term. For the first time, the insult had nowhere to go. Vivian closed the folder. As she stood, she said I had wanted to be above her from the beginning. I thought of the unsigned resignation letter. All I had wanted then was to remain the owner of my own time. I told her that reporting structures were not measures of human worth. They were tools for assigning responsibility. Hale House had confused authority with entitlement for too long. She left without answering. The next morning, the lender circulated the final deadline. Payroll was due in 5 days. 2 vendors had placed the company on credit hold. The admission freezes were spreading concern to properties that still passed inspection. Families had begun requesting deposit refunds Hale House could not immediately pay. Vivian continued searching for money that would preserve her control. Marcus called former classmates, developers, and residents' relatives. He promised returns based on occupancy reports Meridian already knew were inaccurate. Counsel warned the board that accepting new funds on those representations could create additional liability. The board finally removed his authority to solicit financing. 3 directors who had supported Vivian for years voted against her. They did not become brave in one moment. They became afraid of signing the next false statement. That distinction mattered, but the vote still changed the outcome. When Vivian signed on day 89, she demanded that the founder title remain on every building. Meridian allowed a historical plaque at the first residence. The company would not place her name above clinical authority, compliance, or financial control. She accepted because the alternative was no longer symbolic defeat. It was insolvency. The closing documents were signed in a lender's conference suite after midnight. I was not in the room. I waited 2 floors below with the operating team, reviewing the list of actions that had to occur before residents woke. Bank access would change at 6. Property directors would receive new reporting instructions at 7. Payroll funds had to clear before 8. Families would receive a plain explanation before rumors could turn a rescue into panic. At 12:41, Evelyn entered carrying the signed authorization. Nobody applauded. We opened our laptops. That response mattered to me. Vivian had built leadership around entrances, speeches, and photographs. Meridian treated control as a burden that began the instant the signatures dried. By sunrise, protected accounts held every available resident deposit. The 5 related party vendors were suspended. Outside pharmacists began reviewing medication systems at the 2 frozen properties. Human Resources restored access to the anonymous hotline and sent employees a written promise that safety reports would not be routed through the Hale family. At Cedar Grove, the morning supervisor cried when she read the message. She had kept copies of 3 unanswered complaints in her locker because she expected headquarters to erase them. Those copies led us to additional staffing records, including schedules altered after shifts ended. The changes made missed coverage appear complete and converted overtime into ordinary hours on reports sent to lenders. We paid the employees correctly before deciding who had authorized the alterations. Marcus sent an email at 4 in the morning, accusing Meridian of seizing his family's private information. Counsel reminded him that the records belonged to the company and were required under the acquisition agreement. Vivian sent nothing. Her silence lasted until the announcement meeting. I spent the hours before it walking through the first Hale House residence without an entourage. The marble still shone. Breakfast still arrived on china. Near the service elevator, a nursing assistant used tape to keep the sole of her shoe together. I asked when uniforms and footwear allowances had last been issued. She said headquarters canceled them during the expansion. In the lobby, a bronze plaque thanked Vivian for preserving a tradition of uncompromising care. The contradiction was almost too obvious to be symbolic. I approved emergency equipment and clothing allowances that morning. The expense was smaller than the floral budget for one founder gala. That was the company I was about to lead, wealthy in surfaces, indebted in promises, and full of people who had learned to solve institutional failures with tape. When I finally entered the boardroom, I did not feel that I had climbed above Vivian. I felt I had reached the place where her choices could no longer be pushed downward onto people with less power. The nameplate at the head of the table was not a trophy, it was a receipt. Before the announcement, Meridian's counsel reviewed my role one final time. I could direct operations, safety, staffing, and integration. I could approve ordinary expenses within policy. I could not alter Vivian's compensation, extend her transition contract, or decide any claim related to Marcus. Those matters belonged to the independent committee. I asked for the restrictions to be included in the written minutes, not because I expected to misuse authority, because people who had spent years watching Vivian use a company as an extension of family power needed to see that my authority had edges. The first operating memo carried 4 signatures, not one: mine, the controllers, the chief clinical officers, and outside compliance counsels. It froze related party payments, protected safety records, preserved wages, and prohibited destruction of paper or electronic files. Every property received the same instructions. No manager had to guess which leader mattered more. Hale House's communications director warned that the restrictions might make the transition appear hostile. I asked what would make it appear safe to employees who had watched Lena lose her job. He had no answer. We changed the message. Instead of praising a seamless partnership, it acknowledged financial instability, promised continuity of resident care, and explained where employees could report interference. Families received a separate telephone line, staffed by people who had access to actual deposit records. The company would not use elegance as a substitute for information. At 7:30, the first call came from a resident's daughter who had requested a refund 3 months earlier. Her mother had died before moving into Bellwether Ridge. Hale House still held a $40,000 deposit and had stopped returning calls. The liability appeared on one internal ledger, but not on the cash forecast sent to lenders. We verified the claim and placed it in the protected repayment queue. By 9, there were 23 similar calls. That morning alone explained why the old occupancy number was fiction. Hale House had counted some deposits as future residents, while delaying the refunds that proved those residents would never arrive. Vivian called the queue an overreaction when she learned about it. She said respectable families understood that large refunds required patience. I asked the controller how long the oldest approved refund had waited. 211 days. The family had already paid for a funeral. We issued the payment before lunch. Meridian did not have enough cash to solve every problem instantly. We prioritized safety, wages, resident funds, and critical vendors. Decorative projects stopped. Founder events stopped. A warehouse held thousands of dollars in custom table linens, while 2 properties rationed replacement batteries for medical lifts. We returned what could be returned and sold what could be sold. The proceeds funded equipment. When employees heard that decision, more records surfaced. A maintenance supervisor produced photographs of water damage hidden behind temporary wall panels before a lender tour. A sales manager disclosed instructions to leave canceled reservations in the occupancy system until quarter end. A payroll specialist brought a spreadsheet comparing actual badge access with official staffing schedules. Each person expected punishment. Each person had learned that truth moved upward only when polished enough not to embarrass Vivian. We thanked them, preserved the files, and told them retaliation would be investigated. The change in posture created more evidence than any dramatic raid could have found. It also showed me why becoming Vivian's boss could never be treated as a private victory. Hundreds of employees were measuring whether the new hierarchy protected them or simply replaced one favored family member with another. I had to earn the difference in public decisions. Shortly before the boardroom meeting, Marcus sent me a personal message. He said I had finally obtained what I always wanted. I read it twice. During our marriage, what I had wanted was a career, access to my own money, a truthful partner, and the right to decline 187 chores assigned without my consent. He had converted every boundary into ambition and every consequence into revenge. I did not answer. Counsel archived the message because it referred to the transaction. Then I turned off my personal phone. The boardroom would contain Vivian, attorneys, lenders, directors, and people who needed clear instructions before the next shift began. My old marriage had no useful seat at that table. The announcement meeting took place in the same Hale House boardroom where Vivian had once hosted our engagement dinner. The long table was still polished to a mirror shine. Her late husband's portrait still hung beside the windows. Marcus was absent. Attorneys, lenders, regional directors, and Meridian executives filled every chair. Vivian entered last. She knew Meridian had assigned an executive, but no one had told her which one. When she saw my nameplate at the head of the table, she stopped. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. I did not smile. I did not mention the resignation letter, the recovery schedule, the money Marcus took, or the relatives who called me selfish. I opened the transition binder and explained the reporting structure. All property directors reported through the new operating team. Finance reported to Meridian's controller. Clinical quality reported to me. Vivian's communications, appearances, resident meetings, and public statements required approval during the transition. Her title remained impressive. Her authority did not. Vivian asked whether this was revenge. It was the only personal question she asked in front of the room. I told her the structure had been approved by independent directors and lenders because the company needed accountable leadership. Then I moved to the first safety item. Becoming her boss did not feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility with witnesses. For the next 90 days, Vivian tested every boundary. She instructed a property manager to delay a staffing change until after a donor reception. The manager forwarded the request to me. I overruled it and documented the incident. She promised residents that the formal dining budget would never change, despite unpaid food vendors. We corrected the statement and protected nutrition spending before decorative events. She attempted to enter a clinical review meeting. Security did not remove her. The compliance director simply reminded her that her contract did not grant access and closed the door. Each time, Vivian acted shocked that a rule applied to her. The transition team did not humiliate her. We did something she found harder to bear. We made the company function without her permission. We raised frontline wages before restoring executive bonuses. We created minimum staffing floors tied to resident needs rather than marketing budgets. We reopened the anonymous reporting line and required every complaint to be tracked through resolution. We paid overdue vendors, repaired call systems, and contacted every family affected by the admission freeze. We also removed expensive traditions that existed mainly for photographs. The ice sculptures disappeared. The string quartets became monthly instead of weekly. The residents kept the gardens, the libraries, the good meals, and the staff members who finally had time to sit beside them. Within 6 months, medication errors fell by 31%. Within 9, employee turnover dropped at every property. The state lifted both admission freezes after follow-up inspections. Occupancy recovered because families trusted the buildings again, not because accountants redefined empty rooms. Vivian completed 78 of her 90 transition days. On day 79, she arranged an interview with a business magazine without approval. She planned to describe Meridian's changes as temporary measures she had personally directed. The reporter sent the questions to our communications team for verification. Her contract was terminated that afternoon by the independent committee. I signed the notice as her supervisor. It was the first document bearing both our names that she had not written for me. Vivian left the building through the main entrance. No security spectacle, no family audience, no victory speech. She received the compensation her contract required, and nothing beyond it. Months later, she sent me a handwritten letter. She said Hale House no longer felt like her company. She said Marcus was struggling and that my choices had destroyed their future. Near the end, she wrote that none of this would have happened if I had understood the meaning of family. I kept the letter because it clarified something I had once spent years trying to understand. Vivian believed family meant a hierarchy. Love flowed downward when authority was obeyed. Duty flowed upward without limit. Anyone who refused their assigned place was cruel. I had not destroyed that system. I had simply stopped standing inside it. Marcus contacted me once during the turnaround. He wanted me to recommend him for a position at one of Meridian's development partners. I forwarded the request to Human Resources and recused myself. The company reviewed his qualifications through its normal process and declined. He accused me of making it personal. For once, I had done the exact opposite. 2 years after the acquisition, Hale House operates 11 properties. 1 unsafe development was sold, and the money strengthened the remaining residences. Lena Brooks now leads regional operations. The night shift teams have staffing levels the old budgets called impossible. Residents still dress for holiday dinners beneath the chandeliers, but nobody funds the chandeliers by hiding empty rooms or exhausted employees. I am no longer Chief Restructuring Officer. Meridian's board asked me to become permanent Chief Executive of the Senior Living Division. I accepted. The cream resignation letter Vivian wrote in my name is stored in a folder at home beside the final divorce decree and the Hale House acquisition announcement. I do not keep it because I am angry. I keep it because it marks the moment someone else tried to make my life smaller and called it service. Vivian demanded that I quit a career built through years of work so I could manage her flowers, meals, visitors, and comfort. She expected my husband, my finances, and family pressure to finish the argument for her. Instead, I protected my name, followed the money, kept my job, and learned how care businesses fail when ego outranks accountability. 3 years after she put a resignation letter beside my dinner plate, she sat beneath her husband's portrait while I explained the limits of her new role. But becoming her boss was never the real victory. The victory was that by the time she reported to me, I no longer needed her to understand what she had done. I only needed her to follow the same rules she once believed were meant for everyone else.